I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here tonight to share my artwork with you and some of the research that I've been doing to relate art and religion. I want to thank Montgomery College and the Germantown campus, and in particular Joan Nake and David Carter, for inviting me here and for the honor of participating in this Athenaeum Symposia speaker series. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight with you. I'm going to sort of rely on my remarks and then have some Q&A afterwards. First of all, I think I feel I need to say that I'm equipped really only to speak, I think, on one set of topics. And when given the opportunity to say what I wish, I'll invariably speak or circle around the same set of themes that I have spoken of before. For me, because these themes are so meaningful, I never really feel as though I've said anything worthwhile. They're always ahead of me, as Jacques Derrida said of any text he was trying to interpret. Jacques Derrida was a 20th century philosopher, and he said he thought that meaning was an experience to be had through an act of faith, not primarily in the past and an act of faith in tradition, but an act of faith in the future and its ever new possibilities for modification and growth. In other words, meaning is an experience, a process, and not a product to be packaged up into explicit language that's decontextualized into abstractions that end up being used like so many bricks that are stacked into a wall and then a structure. This thought structure can sometimes give the illusion of meaning that it's permanent, that's impenetrable, and in the end only serves to exclude the other in some way. And I hope my words tonight are explicit enough to follow, but implicit enough to tease your imaginations, and more importantly, your intuition, so that we might make enough room for each other and enough room for the future to break into our present. So what are the themes that stand before us tonight? They are the themes of art and spirit, of creativity and beauty, experienced here in the United States in the 21st century, in our experience of nature and life and the self. I named this talk, The Future Art, Re-Enchantment in Contemporary Culture. I'm not only interested in the future of art, but in the future art, the art that may be breaking now into our present, destabilizing what are the current values of society and culture. I hope this title also signals for you, for those who may know of, Max Weber and his thought. He was an early 20th century German philosopher who spoke of the disenchantment of the world, owing to the rise of science and technology that was championed by the Enlightenment, exploited by the Industrial Revolution and the rational administration of the economy. This disenchantment of the world has also been called the de-divinizing of the world. And with the rise of all of this material mastery of the 19th and 20th centuries, it became possible to attend the world in an increasingly mechanistic way, to see it as a dead or semi-living machine, not as a fully living and growing organism that belonged to spiritual forces or was animated by these forces. With the expulsion of God from the material world in the modern period, reality becomes disenchanted, de-divinized in the consciousness of those for whom this mechanistic worldview holds compelling fascination. Tonight, I would like to cover 3 topics, and the first one is to cover 5 different relationships between art and religion. And then I want to focus in on the 5th type, which is defines or characterizes our contemporary context. And then thirdly, I would like to go into or share some of my own work and how it is that I'm trying to relate art and religion in possibly a 6th and new way. So my main goal is to make it clear that there are many relationships between art and religion that have gained purchase in the consciousness of human beings throughout history at different times and in different places. The first, I want to show you kind of a graph that I'll use here. The first column is just called the type of relationship between art and religion. The second column is labeled training. Now this is really important because the context of training for artists help us understand or help to contribute to a relationship between art and religion. You know, how a teacher hands down a tradition to a student tells us a lot about that tradition, what kind of building they're in, what kind of facilities they use, what kind of teaching pedagogy they use. So institutions for educating artists build and they perpetuate and extend a world of meaning for their communities that make it possible for different types of limitations of thought, feeling, and behavior to be explored. These training contexts bring with them a social construct of norms that defines their reason for being. The third column in the chart is a list of art contexts sanctioned by the authority structures of any time or place. And these spaces in which art are shared are listed to show you how framing objects of cultural meaning contributes centrally to what that meaning is. So to place objects in these spaces is to label them in a certain way as art. If the visual object is not inside one of these spaces, it's not seen as art by the community of that time. The fourth column, the last one, is the artist paradigm, and this is important as well to note the way that art is related to religion. Each artist paradigm that I list here is sort of a rule of thumb or a heuristic device that describes the personality of the creative person in correspondence with each type. So the first type I would maybe just call a cosmic relationship between art and religion. It produces a kind of art that helps ritual. It's mythological. It's totemic. It makes totems that kind of bind social groups together. This kind of art was initiated from the beginning of time in terms of human history, about 30,000 years ago, to about 3,500 years BCE, which is around the time that we started to build cities. This kind of art, this imagery, emphasizes or expresses a oneness of all forms in creation, in mythic time and space, instead of a historic or scientific notion of time or space. So this art is made from the experience of being one with yourself, with divinity, with the tribe, and with the earth. A training context maybe would be rites of passage, during rituals of rites of passage for boys becoming men, girls becoming women. You find this art in caves, in the natural world, or the daily life, or quotidian. And you would think of these artists being artisans, craftsmen. It's more of a humble kind of role. And an obvious example might be the Lascaux caves in France that were painted in caves and very dark lit. We're not sure why they were made. We know that they were possibly made for ritual or rites of passage. And this is an example of contemporary cave art, actually, that was made by Aboriginal tribes in Australia. So we still see this art today. The second type is what I would call a devotional relationship between art and religion. And this kind of creates an art that is expressing a social cohesion. It's art made from the experience of being separate from the earth, so the human being sort of separates out from the earth, but is still one with the tribe, still one with the self, still one with divinity. And this art serves devotion to God and devotion to the state and the king, and therefore it bolsters a stable identity in society. And you're seeing in this kind of period from 3500 to 1350, right before the Renaissance begins, apprenticeships and guilds. And you'll see this artwork in tombs, sanctuaries, temples, and also in daily life. And this is the artist as theologian, or artist as priest, or artist as teacher. This is the artist is kind of a mouthpiece for the state, or a mouthpiece for the church, or some kind of religion. Good example, obvious example, at least in the West, are icons which were made under a very strict rubric, how you make them. And you see this even today, sort of iconic kind of Christian art. This is a good example of Kent Twitchell, who is in Los Angeles. He's a contemporary mural artist. who's a Christian, and this was made at a Christian school in Los Angeles, Biola University, of the Christ holding a Bible. It's just called the Word. So this is serving a religious tradition and not kind of engaging a wider audience in a certain way. Although it does have a wider appeal, I would say. The third relationship I would call a rational relationship, and this was initiated right about the time of the Renaissance, where art, this is the age of reason, it sort of builds into the age of reason. This is an experiment of art being unrelated to religion. Where there's no explicit, in some cases, explicit relationship to religion. It's a turning to nature and a turning to matter and a beginning to turn away from the spirit. And this art is made from the point of view of the individual identity and empirical perception. So the invention of the one-point perspective allows consciousness to be individualized. So the individual stands apart from the tribe, he stands apart from the earth, and starts to question the notion of divinity and the authority of the state and the authority of family. So art serves the rational mind and it serves individual identity. You still have apprenticeships, but also now academies are starting to come onto the scene, and the context for this type of art you'll see are salons and museums. The artist paradigm is a genius hero, someone who's sort of almost godlike and has an exalted role in society. And an obvious example would be Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. And a contemporary version of this is John Nava. He's a contemporary artist living today in Los Angeles as well. And this is from a tapestry series that he made at the Los Angeles Cathedral in LA, downtown LA. This tapestry is about 3 stories high or so. And so he's using realistic, or I call this mimetic art. It's trying to imitate nature, trying to be realistic or photorealistic. And so he's using actual photographs, and then he paints from those photographs, and then tapestries this images onto cloth. So this is alive and well today, this kind of art. The fourth type I'm calling a critical relationship between art and religion. Initiated around the time of 1860, when modern art is starting to change the scene, and goes until the 1960s when another change happens. This is more experiments in art with no explicit relationship to religion, and art is really about itself. It's art about art. Art's made with a self-critical turn to the psyche, the intellect, sort of negating the body in a certain way. And art is made from the point of view of the Western isolated individual who is rational, not religious. Art serves an elite individual identity of the wealthy and the European. And in the training context, you see universities, art schools. And the white cube is where you find this artwork. This is sort of the nickname of gallery spaces. You paint a room white, and you give the illusion that this is a neutral space, and you put the artwork in there. Of course, it's not a neutral space. It's politically charged, and there's been books written about that charged nature of this white cube. But the idea is to make the viewer think that they're just an eyeball looking at the artwork, and there's no distractions. So you sort of lose consciousness of your body, and you become a voyeur, or just a looker. The kind of artist paradigm prophet, they're prophesying a new kind of rational art. Healer, shaman, they're kind of trying to heal you of your superstitions, your attachment to religion, your attachment to superstitions of the past, traditions. They're rebels, they're rebelling against the church, rebelling against the state, rebelling against any kind of social structures that have, really firm grasp on people. A good example, this is the beginning of this, Manet, Van Gogh, Cézanne, the beginning of this new artwork that's really idiosyncratic. It's really not clear what the language is saying here. It's realistic, but why is this woman, this black woman, holding flowers on this white nude woman? It's sexually charged, but what's the sexuality here? So you really have to kind of learn what's this artist's story, what's their language. So it's really about the individual and what they're trying to say, and that becomes more important. And this that's the early 1800s and goes all the way to the 60s to Jackson Pollock. This is a good picture of Jackson Pollock doing his drip paintings. This is art about art. This is art about painting. Art it's about the paint itself, and how the act of painting is this kind of, passionate experience, and it's recorded in the drips. And so art is explicitly about itself. It's very philosophical. In the last relationship, and this is our context today, I'm calling it no relationship between art and religion. And it's a postmodern, post-art context. And I put no because, in quotes, there is, of course, a relationship, but it's a contentious relationship. And at this time, there's a turn to the social constructed nature of language, that there's no stable center to find one's identity. Now the individual is separate from the earth, separate from the tribe, separate from divinity, separate from your own self. And art expresses a sense of alienation, anxiety. Art seeks to destabilize social norms. It doesn't seek to stabilize them as they did in the cosmic and devotional periods. Now it's seeking to destabilize them. So art becomes a good place to put your money. It's no longer a place to really create social identity or social cohesion. It's a good place to put investments. So art is investment in social, cultural, and economic capital. And so the training grounds for this is what I went through: universities, art schools, and the context are anywhere that art institutions say it is. So art is art when the art world says it's art. That's sort of how it works. And so you can make art, but if you're outside those institutions, then you're not regarded as an artist. I mean, you might be making imagery and maybe you can break in. That's sort of the hope. And so the artist paradigm, in a certain way, you have to be a good marketer. You have to market yourself. You got to be a good salesperson, and then ultimately a celebrity, someone who has a good brand and a good brand identity, and is able to sell that brand identity and create buzz, around your work. And a good example of this began with Duchamp in the 19-teens. This is art that's questioning if whether or not it's art. It's very philosophical. This is Duchamp going out to a Home Depot, his version of Home Depot, getting a fountain, putting it on a pedestal, and saying, "Is this art?" Now this is where the context is very, very important. So the artist is saying, this context tells you that it's art because it's on a pedestal. It's in a white cube. So therefore it's art. So it's making fun of that whole kind of mentality. And he doesn't even sign his name, Marcel Duchamp. He signs it R. Mutt, 1917. So he's even questioning the role of the artist. He's even questioning himself. Who's the artist? And then it sort of becomes mainstream under Andy Warhol, and he does a similar thing where he takes Brillo boxes that you can get from a Safeway, and then he just reproduces them as art. He puts them in an art museum. So it's the same idea. Jeff Koons, his contemporary, does the same thing with these vacuums, and frames and puts them in these clear acrylic boxes, cubes, that makes and lights them from underneath. So they've become precious, they become sacred. And he's sort of making fun of our very notion of doing that, of taking something that's made by somebody else, putting it in a box and lighting it up in a gallery. So it's art that's questioning itself as art. Am I art? And God gets lost, community gets lost, individual identity gets lost. And so you kind of go into these galleries in New York and Soho or wherever, Chelsea, and you come out feeling like, what did I just see? I don't know. So part 2, our times. Let me talk about this a little bit more. Today, in the Academy of the Social Sciences, as well as in the departments of fine arts all across the United States, a tension exists between worldviews that either regret or celebrate a disenchanted world, on the one hand, and worldviews that advocate or celebrate an enchanted world, on the other. Not long ago, in 2009, James Elkins, an art historian from the Art Institute of Chicago, and David Morgan, a scholar of religious studies from Duke University, hosted a seminar on this topic of re-enchantment, and they later wrote a book about it. And this book describes the discussions that occurred at this seminar between art theorists, artists, scholars of religion, and art history. And this seminar produced some very interesting and informative essays and discussions, but for the most part, It just highlighted deep mistrust and misunderstanding between those who would consider themselves non-religious members of the art world and those who would consider themselves as practicing religious people. And in the end, what the seminar principally accomplished was to spotlight the conflict that exists between the art world and the world of religions. It is to James Elkins's credit, actually, being a member of the secular art world, to openly engage this topic and the religious community, because he's gotten a lot of criticism from his art world peers. He's not religious himself, so he has no dog in this fight. He's simply a good scholar studying a real phenomenon in our culture. Elkins, in fact, wrote a book in 2004 called On the Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art, and which I recommend if you are interested in this subject. From his perspective, in this book, he argues religion really has no place in the contemporary art world. And this is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. He's not saying this is how it should be, he's just saying that this is how it is. And he gives examples. He says if you look at accepted art magazines or journals, religion is usually absent. If you look at important art history texts that are about art since 1945, they usually have nothing to say about religion or religious art or the relationship between art and religion. Or if you observe the pedagogy of studio art programs, how do teachers teach art at art schools? They routinely ignore religious themes or encourage students to ignore them. And this is based on his own experience. He says he thinks that most art teachers feel intimidated by this subject matter because they think that whatever they will be saying is wrong. They're intimidated by religion. So Elkins then goes on to give 5 ways that art students deal with religious themes, and all of which don't receive encouragement from art professors. These ways are based on anecdotal evidence that he acquired in tutoring art students at the Art Institute of Chicago who came to him on the slide. They had to sneak to him to get critiques of their artwork. The first kind of artwork they're doing is avowedly religious art, kind of straightforward. And a good example, a famous example of this is Mikado Fujimura, who's a Japanese-American artist in New York, and he's a Christian. He does abstract expressionistic kind of work, gold leafing, and he's recently illustrated the King James Bible of the Gospels. And he's sort of kind of on the fringes of the art world. He's not really totally accepted. Another example of an avowedly religious artist is someone from our neighborhood, Frederick Hart. He did the National Cathedral. If you go to the National Cathedral on Wisconsin Avenue in D.C., he did the kind of beautiful figurative works that are on the doors of the cathedral. He also pioneered clear acrylic casting. This looks like glass, but it's cast plastic. But very explicit religious art. Another method artist students use is to use new religious movement art. And a good example of that is Alex Gray. He's interested in psychedelic experiences, and out of that psychedelic experience, using drugs, using LSD or things like that, to get like a higher state of consciousness, and out of that higher state to make art. And he does things like this that are kind of very cosmic and psychedelic. So he's a good example of this kind of art that doesn't get play in the art world. The third type is art that's critical of religion. This is like more accepted in the art world, but even this is not fully accepted. But a good example of this is Andre Serrano, and a famous photograph he did was, it's called Piss Christ. It's a crucifix suspended in urine. So it made a lot of press, and people, all the kind of Christian groups got angry, and he was very gratified, and the art world was like, good. And whenever you see religious art, it's usually this kind of artwork in the newspaper. The fourth type is art that burns away religion in the hopes of finding a true essence. And a good example, I think, of this is Anselm Kiefer, German artist. He works in tar and lead and burning things on his canvas. He's I think Jewish, because he's always talking about the Holocaust and the incredible tragedy of that event and in his artwork. He's also interested in Kabbalah, which is the mystical tradition of Judaism, And so in this painting, it's called Zim Zoom, which is a Kabbalistic understanding of how the universe was first created, this withdrawal of God withdrew from himself to create an empty space in which creation was made. So he burns away things to kind of get to a true essence of what religion is, burning away the tradition, burning away the exterior part of religion. The last type that Elkins saw in his students is they would make unconsciously religious art. They would come to him with artwork that was clearly religious, it looked religious, but the student would say, I'm not doing that, that's not what I'm doing. And so, in some ways, Mark Rothko is a good example of that, although he's very much a famous, well-respected art world artist. But he was interested in how all these color fields created moods and feelings of different mystical experience. And for him, he came from a Jewish background and was interested in how hugs of color would affect your imagination and your experience, your visual experience. And there's a recent play actually in DC that was on Mark Rothko that was excellent, kind of exploration of his own creative process, just called Red. The exploration of the color red. What does that mean? Death, life, all sorts of things in between. So Elkins essentially says in sum that secular institutions of the art world have to lose some of their phobia about religion if there's going to be any kind of move forward. And I would argue that there's phobia on the other side. Many religious people in positions of authority are fearful of the art world because the standards of the art world usually judge religious art as being weak art, as being watered down modernism and too sentimental, according to Elkins. And many religious groups view the innovations of the art world, their forms and their media, and their content as morally problematic, as too sexually or violently provocative. Usually, artists in the art world use postmodern strategies for creative expression, which use irony, anxiety, and self-criticism. And these strategies of irony and self-criticism and anxiety, that's kind of threatening to a religious person. So it's more acceptable to be ironic about religious realities than to be devotional. It's more acceptable to be anxious about God's presence than to be sincere. It's more acceptable to expose the falsehood, injustice, or limitation in religious practice and teaching than to celebrate religious life and experience. So in the face of all this, oftentimes religious authorities retreat into past forms of religious art. In the Roman Catholic context, for instance, it's common for parishes to order religious imagery from catalogs than to hire contemporary artists to interpret religious themes in new ways. Now, I do think that there's some promising signs between art and religion that's going on right now today. I don't have time exactly to go over those in terms of how the art world's maybe engaging with religion in a new way and how the religious worlds are engaging with the art world. And I put those on a handout that you have there, some examples that are on that sheet. Well, when I say the art world and religious, I think I should define what I mean by those terms, and I want to focus on a more sociological definition, and we have our sociology professor and students here. And the art world is straightforward enough to describe from this perspective. It's comprised of galleries, art critics, theorists, museums, auction houses, collectors, investors, and the artists, of course. It's a very small world, actually. It's very decentered, but it's very interconnected. It's interconnected between cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Paris, Berlin, and even Beijing now. And they claim a lot of attention now in the world of the arts. Now, the players and the sociological description maybe of the religious side are more difficult to describe. There are many religions in the United States because we are a veritable nursery for all kinds of religious expression. Sociologist Peter Berger, he's from Boston University teaching there. He describes the U.S. in the following way when it comes to religion. First, he notes that Sweden is the most non-religious country in the world, according to sociological surveys, and that India is the most religious. It's easy to go from one Swedish church to another without encountering anybody using it. And then if you go to India, you can't kind of bump into a shrine or a temple and not see it just filled with people and everybody is publicly worshiping. So Peter Berger says the United States is a country that is filled with a majority of Indians with an intelligentsia that is Swedish. He makes the point that our cultural elite, the so-called Swedes, compartmentalize religious practice as they seek to set it apart from public life and relegate it to the private sphere. The rest of the citizens of the United States, however, the Indians, do not compartmentalize religion, but see a need to practice their personal beliefs in public ways and don't see any problem with this. The American nation of religious people is increasingly diverse, increasingly public, and just like it is in India, while the cultural elite increasingly expresses a Swedish secular outlook that is more and more homogeneous. So when I talk about the reality of religion, I'm talking about any and all religious traditions that we can easily identify with their institutional forms, as well as the growing reality of people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, who, when taking surveys about religious affiliation, mark the box labeled none. So according to the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, a 2007 survey, 16% of American adults say they are currently unaffiliated with any particular religion. And now, this is the fastest growing demographic of people who identify in relationship to religion in the United States. In a more recent poll by Pew in 2009, they found that nearly half of the public, 49%, says that they have had a religious or mystical experience defined as a moment of sudden religious insight or awakening. Now, this is similar to a survey that was conducted in 2006, but much higher than in surveys conducted in 1976, 1994, and then twice as high as a 1962 Gallup survey. And in fact, this 2009 survey finds that religious and mystical experiences are more common today among those who are unaffiliated with any particular religion than they were in the 1960s among the public as a whole. So we have a diverse and creative religious landscape where religious affiliation is less stable than it used to be, but religious experience or experience of God is more pervasive than it used to be. And these trends are growing. They're actually not staying the same. So it stands to reason that artistic expression in the 21st century context in the United States would at least carry the spirit of this religious experience. The spirit is expressed everywhere but the art world, in fact. And I guess I could call myself a case study of this fact. I'm in fact an individual case study of the conflicts that exist between religion and art in America. In the past 22 years, I have found myself mixing the values of the art world and religious study of different kinds. And I could describe myself, I suppose, as an Indian Swede or a Swedish Indian, for I'm a spiritual artist who's also an academic in the field of religious studies and visual culture. I've created a niche for my career, and I have a studio where I can create sculptures for the wonderful clientele who support me in what I'm trying to do. And as an academic, I'm still learning the tensions between art and religion. And I'm new to the game of scholarship and find that there are new and interesting opportunities to create dialogue, just like this one tonight. So I've been like a pendulum swinging between art and religion in my life. And when I was first studying art, I was at the University of Notre Dame, as David said. I studied art there, and I had the opportunity to go to Rome and to Israel, to study the arts of Italy, and then to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, who was very important to me. And so I had an artistic and religious experience that was very, very strong at this place. I decided I wanted to try to become a priest. I was interested in priesthood, and I went to seminary for a year. And while I was in seminary, I had the opportunity to be a caregiver for hospice. I was helping a man die of AIDS at the time, and he did die while he was under my care. And what happened was I made an artwork that was kind of about him and about this experience. This was kind of a way to process his death. I called it the Abandonment because I wanted to capture that moment when Christ on the cross said, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Which was actually a psalm that he was praying. It was a prayer that goes on to actually praise God for not abandoning him. So it's actually a psalm that's about praise. But still, I wanted to capture that moment of incredible pain and loneliness and vulnerability. So it's nude, it's painful. It was my first commission. It was for the crypt chapel of the Basilica at Notre Dame, and the parishioners there either loved it or hated it. They really loved it or they really hated it. And I just loved that reaction. I thought it was really gratifying. And so this was 1992, and it's about 4 feet tall. So I left seminary, realized I really wanted to be an artist. What I was called to do was to be an artist, not a priest. So I went back to Notre Dame and got a bachelor's in fine arts, and my professors they were uncomfortable, even there, with me doing religious artwork. At least that was so explicit, and they tried to encourage me not to do religious artwork. But I was young and rebellious, and I decided I'm going to do it. So I just kept doing it. And I actually was very interested not only in Christian theology. I got into Zen Buddhism. I read Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a famous Zen Buddhist, and his books really influenced me. I was reading Thomas Merton, who's actually a Catholic monk, but he was really involved with interfaith dialogue. He was a poet and a photographer and a mystic. These writings were really, I was reading also the Upanishads and the Gita and different Indian texts, and I was becoming confused which religion I was, but my artwork just became more of a hybrid, I guess, of all of these sources. So I left Notre Dame and I went to Los Angeles. I was at the Claremont Graduate School. It was the only school that took me. I applied to 7 or 8 schools, and they all rejected me, and I don't know why. They didn't tell me, but I suspect the religious artwork wasn't helpful. But Claremont was by far the best school out of all of them that I applied to, and they actually told me they thought my religious work was provocative, and they wanted to see how I might fare in this postmodern art school. And so it was tough. I had my art professors were kind of established artists on the LA art scene, and they would come to my studio for critiques. And the conversations were invariably about, why are you making the figure? Because that's been done. Why are you talking about God? Because that's a superstition that's in the past. So I had a lot of trouble. And then I had one compassionate professor who came to me and said, listen, you should be challenged to do something different. I mean, you can still use the themes that you're interested in, but maybe make it more universally kind of acceptable visually. He said, I'm going to give you a block of clay, and I want you to take this block of clay and take it as far as you can go. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, that's up to you. Sort of like Star Wars or something, Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I said, okay. So I thought about it. I was reading a book at the time by Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary General of the UN, and he said, do not seek death. Death will find you. Seek instead to make death a fulfillment. So I said, I'm going to make death a fulfillment with this block of clay. So I took it on the studio floor in my studio there, and I got a hammer and chisel, and I broke it into pieces. I arranged the pieces in a circle, in a spiral circle, and went from larger to smaller until it became dust. The idea for me, I guess, was my own sense of journey in time and space, and how you die. You eventually have to die, but that death leads to the beginning. It leads to a wholeness. And my professor came the week later and asked me what, he really liked it. He said, what were you thinking about when you did this? I said, well, I was just, nothing deep. I was just trying to get the right pieces in the right places. He said, well, that's pretty deep. He said, what do you want to do now? I said, well, I think I want to go around Los Angeles. I'm going to do this in different places in LA, in some public spaces. He said, that's good. All right, we'll see how that works. So I went first, I'll show you, I went to Joshua Tree Monument, which is a park, and I literally took Joshua trees and I made the circle out of the tree itself. And I went to a Catholic church. I went to a Grand Central Market, which is a Latino market, and tons of people were around. It was really crowded. And so instead of doing a block of clay, I used pennies. It seemed more appropriate for that space, a place of a market, and going from smaller to larger. And homeless man gave me a penny, and people off the street were giving me pennies to make this performance. I went to a Protestant church. I went to a Catholic church. I tried to go to a Jewish temple and a Muslim mosque, but they weren't interested. I went to Rodeo Drive, and I got kicked off of Rodeo Drive. I went to a Zen meditation center, and I just left the circle there and took pictures of it becoming just part of the earth. I went to the place where Rodney King was beaten. Do you guys know who Rodney King is? Yeah, so I went there. The riots had just kind of happened recently at that point, and I'd used the rocks on that land, on that space, to make the prayer circle. So I was really kind of gratified by this because I learned something deeper about what I wanted to say. But at the same time, I still felt restless. I wanted to make objects. I didn't want just to do performance art. So I left Claremont. I didn't get a degree there, and thought that I should get a theology degree and get more of a background in theology. So I came back east, and I went to the Washington Theological Union. It's in D.C., and I got an MA in systematic theology. It's kind of a fancy word for just studying like the symbols of Catholic theology, like what is the Trinity and what is the Christ, things like that. But I was interested in how the arts are theology, how they contribute to theology in a postmodern context. So I wrote a thesis about that. And from there, I decided, well, I definitely want to go, but I just kept going to school. I was really just trying to avoid life, I guess. But I went to the GW at George Washington University and completed my master's in fine arts. I wanted to kind of complete that circle. And it was great because I had an advisor who was a Hare Krishna devotee. He was Hindu. He didn't care what I did in terms of art, so in terms of art and religion. So I was, at the time, again, reading someone named Bede Griffiths. He was, and this is a sketch I did of him, he was a Benedictine monk from England who went to India and started a Christian ashram there. And in that ashram, he was interested in kind of combining Christian and Hindu ritual and Indian ritual. So it was really compelling to me because that's what I was sort of doing in my artwork. And so he wrote a book that talked about the Hindu god Shiva, or Nataraj. He's called the Nataraj. And he's the Lord of the Dance. And I thought, oh, wow, that's sort of a symbol of the Christ as well. And he talked about that in his book, that it's a symbol of the risen Christ and this Hindu god Shiva. And this gives you a 11th, 12th century version of him. He's got 4 arms. One arm's holding a drum, and that's his power to create. His left hand is holding fire, which is his power to destroy. And his third arm is mudra, or gesture, that means do not fear. Because God is always, he can destroy you. So you kind of have to walk gingerly, but do not fear, I'm not going to hurt you. And then the fourth hand is pointing to his foot, which is the place of wisdom in Indian culture. If any of you are Indian or know this culture, you often see people touching the feet of an elder or someone you respect very well. It's also the place where you would sit. You would sit at the feet of a master or a guru and to receive their wisdom. So the feet, it's also, the feet touch the earth, and that point of contact is special. It's spiritual because the earth is, the spiritual energy of the earth comes up through your feet into your body up to the top of your head. So I took a lot of this symbolism, combined it with my own understanding of the Christ and the resurrection and the crucifixion. I kind of thought of destruction and creation, the God of Shiva, and Jesus, crucifixion and resurrection. And so I made a crucified and resurrected Christ with 4 arms. And instead of a circle around, it's got this mandorla shape, which means almond in Italian. This almond shape is really important. It's the symbol of the union of opposites, or the coincidence of opposites. If you put 2 circles, overlap 2 circles, you get that almond shape. So the Christ and Shiva are both uniting all the opposites, death and life, resurrection and creation, destruction and creation. So this sort of shows you my process. This is about 3 feet tall. It's made of ceramic. The Christ figure there is kind of coming out from inside of the gold figure. The impression of the face that's in clay, you can see in the gold behind. So he's coming out from the body is sort of dying and coming out, but leaving behind it this impression in gold. So I graduated, finally got my MFA, decided I would teach. And I was at the Northern Virginia Community College, much like this place here, had wonderful students from all over the place a lot of them were immigrants, and I just enjoyed myself immensely and learned how to teach. I learned about other cultures and was trying to refine my own understanding of the creative process and how to teach. But I was an adjunct and felt like I needed, and I did this for about 5 years and wasn't, getting any inroads to get that permanent teaching position. Thought, well, I guess I'll go back to school. So I did that, and that's where I am now. And but while I was at Northern Virginia Community College, I did this piece, which is St. Francis. He's sort of coming out of his robes, and it's about 3 feet tall, and joining the flight of the doves. If you know St. Francis of Assisi, and he's my favorite saint. He's typically Italian, very he just stripped down to his, there's a famous episode where his father wanted to punish him because he was giving away all of his clothes to the poor, and his father was a rich merchant who sold cloth, and he was giving this cloth away, and the father took Francis to the bishop and said, do something about this guy, or I'm going to disown him. And Francis said, well, fine, you are no longer my father is God in heaven. So he stripped down all of his clothes and he gave it to his father, and that was the beginning of his transformation and his unfolding. And so I'm kind of capturing that moment, but also he had a later experience of being one with God, being one with Jesus on the cross and his resurrection. So I kind of combined his stripping naked and also his joining divinity in this one piece. This is sort of a side view. It's made of bronze and gold leaf and silver leaf with a clear acrylic base. So here I am at Catholic University and getting a PhD in religion and culture, and I'm teaching as well, teaching courses in Catholic theology for freshmen, and I'm using the arts to kind of teach theology, and I'm also teaching Hindu art and religion. And here I'm doing a dissertation on Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, the person that David Carter mentioned. And it's him that inspires me really currently now, but for the last few years. I wish I had more time to explain my studies of him in this PhD program. And I've decided to research the relationship between art and religion using Aurobindo. And I first read about him actually through Bede Griffiths, that monk I mentioned who went to India. He found out about Aurobindo and was floored by him, and I've read him and feel the same way. And I've learned that in my study of Aurobindo, that I've been uniting the worlds of art and religion, creativity and scholarship, sacred and the secular, by means of a special human faculty that we all share at some level. It's what he calls the intuition. The intuition is a hidden stability within our unstable path in life. And for me, as I've bounced back and forth between the spiritual and the material, between art making and scholarship making, it's sort of like an eye inside the hurricane that's calm and stable, but moves along a dynamic path of wild change. So Aurobindo speaks of the intuition as a faculty that is a sea or mass of stable lightnings. He takes this image from the Rig Veda. It's an Indian Hindu text that's 3,700 years old. And it describes Indra, the god Indra, who's the god of thunder and lightning. He's similar to Zeus, Jupiter, or Thor. It's his lightning power that he uses to destroy the lower forces of darkness that would seek to keep human consciousness in their grip. Intuition is also coupled with another image in the Rig Veda, and that's Sarama, the female hound of Indra. Sarama is Sanskrit, and it means the fleet one, who faithfully and quickly frees the light of higher realms hidden on the gross plane, within our own beings. So the intuition has 2 essential characteristics according to Aurobindo's reading of the Rig Veda. The first is that the intuition knows immediately where to find the divine light within us, before the reason, before the intellect, and before the senses. The intuition also finds the truth where you least expect it, in the dark places of your heart. For Aurobindo, the intuition has the role of linking the higher with the lower, the truth that's above with the truth that's within. Now, I kind of took this idea of the heart and the intuition and the idea that divinity is linking this growth of the intuition in all of creation, that there's a heartbeat that's not only within us, that's divine, but it's also in the earth. And so I made a series of sculptures that are on the 4 seasons. And this series celebrates the life of the intuition in the heart and the ecstatic joy of this life no matter what season we are in. So I'll show you, this is a kind of concept drawing that I pushed the button too fast. But it's essentially dancing figures inside of musical instruments for each of the seasons. So this is winter, and they're also made of different metals. Winter's the metal of steel. And she's dancing inside of chimes. And I was just thinking about how winter, I grew up in Colorado part of my life, and think about the snow and the solitude and silence of snow, yet the kind of ding ding, kind of sound that you hear of water dripping or, so I just thought of that for me as winter. But she's got gold on the inside of her, and that's anticipating the spring. Spring is made of gold. But there's more views of winter. There's also clear acrylic chimes with steel chimes. I put a rose on her chest, this kind of blooming of the rose, even inside of winter. That there's a spiritual rose that blooms even in our darkest moments. This is a sketch for spring. I'm really inspired by dance, and I took this image from the dancer anyway, from the Alvin Ailey Dance Theater in New York. They're one of my favorites. So it's a drum, and the drum, on the top part of the drum is a snowflake that's melting, because spring is like the season in between, the full-on heat of the summer, and it's sort of backing and forthing. And so it's this melting snowflake into a figure that's becoming water at the bottom, sort of gold melting. These are all roughly about 3 feet tall. It's not fully, it's gold leaf, I should say. It's not solid gold, it's bronze, but with gold leaf. This is summer, and it's silver leaf on top of bronze with plastic and some clear acrylic at the base. And in this one I was thinking of a flute. You can't see the holes of the flute on the other side, but the flute, kind of this high sweet note of summer, and butterflies are coming out of the flute, joining her dress. The pattern of her dress is butterflies, and then the butterflies kind of become butterflies at the top of her hand. And I was thinking of a sundial. I mean, the sun is high overhead here, and the shadow cast by this figure becomes the base. See how the metal goes from gold to silver. It goes to bronze in autumn, and then steel for winter. This kind of gradual kind of less and less precious metal. So for autumn, I did a harp. I thought about the mellow strings being evocative for that season. So I was experimenting with different ideas for dancers. So I chose this guy. I took some leaves from outside of my studio, and I cast them in bronze. And so he's cast in bronze as well, and then the silver leaf on the inside is sort of hearkening back to the summer. And the clear acrylic rod that's there is hearkening forward to the winter, because you got the winter rods that are the chimes. This is about 4 feet tall. So the idea of the heart, all of these figures, kind of like with the chest wide open, ecstatic feeling. So I feel like I'm trying to come up with a new way of making art and making new relationship between art and religion. And for me, I guess I would call it a relationship of service. An art that's of the age of intuition. It blends the age of Sweden, the kind of material mastery and secularism of Sweden, with the spiritual mastery and religious consciousness of India. This is consciousness that's a reunion of the self with itself, with God, with the tribe, but this tribe is now global, and a reunion with the earth. It's art made from the point of view of the senses, the psyche, the intellect, all lit from within by the faculty of the intuition located in the heart. Art serves all phases and forms of life in a fully non-sectarian way. So some of the training institutions maybe would be any institution that prizes art as service and as it also prizes the faculty of the intuition. Where would this be made? I guess it could be made in any place that human beings want to be reminded of how and why to become more fully human, both individually and collectively. And the paradigm is, taking this from Aurobindo, he uses this word, the kavi. Kavi is a Sanskrit word that I'm just using to mean the intuitive artist. But if you look it up in a Sanskrit dictionary, it means a poet, a seer, a prophet, or sage. As a noun, and as an adjective, it means gifted with knowledge, insight, knowing, enlightened, wise, sensible, prudent, skillful, or cunning. Aurobindo wrote a book called The Future Poetry, and I'm kind of using this as an inspiration as the future art. But his book, The Future Poetry, one of the principal themes of that book is that the future art is one that is formed by the senses, the emotions, and the intellect, following the dictates of the intuition. For him, the future age of intuition is art. In art was more secure if the material mastery of England, Europe, and the United States blended with those of India, converged in a new way to protect the faculty of intuition from the powerful yet clumsy and ignorant lower mind or the intellect that seeks always to control without really knowing the way. For Aurobindo, the material mastery of the West, the very thing that caused the disenchantment of the world for Max Weber, the one that he described this disenchantment of the world as being kind of quintessentially a Western thing. This Western material mastery is a necessary part of the equation for a new world culture. To take the arc of learning that exists in the West and blend it with the arc of learning in India, with its wealth of spiritual mastery, this, Aurobindo saw, was the key and the way forward. So I've shown you all tonight my own experiments in sculpture and visual art, my own attempts to blend India with Sweden. I think the future is very bright, and there's every reason to be enchanted once again with the divine that is waiting within us, waiting to be freed from the cave of our material mastery, the cave of our own hearts. Thank you very much.
It's interesting that you mentioned Sweden. I happen to belong to the Swedish Colonial Historical Society in Philadelphia. And it raised a question in my mind when you mentioned Peter Berger, famous sociologist, about the Swedes being, less religious. The Swedes, when they came to the United States in 1634, they arrived here on a boat called the Kalmar Nickel. And the Fogelgrip was the other ship that came. But when they entered and they came to Penn Treaty Park in Philadelphia, and they encountered the Lenape Native Americans, Indians, their sense of religion was very different than the one you just described in terms of modern times, because they believed that they didn't build many forts, because they felt that religion was also a fabric of the social life. There was no separation between the social life and religion. The fact that they were one and the same. So my question, I guess, goes to, in terms of modern societies, in terms of industrialization and rationalization and the scientific methods that go with that, is that more a function of the de-emphasizing of religion, in your opinion, and that sort of crosses all kinds of countries and cultures, and it's sort of, I guess you play down religion, is what I'm looking for, in terms of a scientific community where it's seen as maybe superstitious, maybe something that holds you back, maybe that's something that takes away from free thinking, et cetera, as opposed to being integrated with science. So you think it's more of a function of just modern industrialization, this the emphasis of religion, and almost an embarrassment, if you will.
Well, notice that both the United States and Europe are equally industrialized, yet the Swedes in America are still religious. The Swedes in Europe are not. There's something telling about that. It has nothing, I think, there's not a relationship so much between the industrial, being scientific is not incompatible with being religious in America. It is for those in Europe. And Europe's becoming more and more an anomaly in the world. The more the thought was if maybe you've heard of the Secularization Thesis. So this thesis goes that the more secular a country becomes, the more it gets out of the third world, becomes a first world country, they will get rid of religion. And that's just not been the case. It's not happened. In fact, Peter Berger was the one to champion that secularization thesis. But then he had to admit there's just no evidence for it. In fact, the opposite is true. We become more religious, especially in Muslim countries, in Africa, in Asia. They're becoming more and more modern, and they're retaining their religion and becoming more and more religious. Europe's the only continent that seems to be staunchly holding on to maybe a superstition in secularism. So Peter Berger's just noting, and I don't know. This is a whole discipline of study of why secularization. What is the relationship between secularization and religion, and it really comes down to the particular country and why it's happening. Because Sweden's different from Italy, from France, from Germany. They all have their own histories with religion and their own reasons for wanting to reject religion publicly. And so, that's just to answer your question. I think, there's political and psychological necessities going on in Europe that we don't have here. We didn't have a revolution that was interested in stringing up every last monarch with the guts of the last priests that they said, in the French Revolution. We had a very kind of a revolution that was it was inspired by religion. Actually, we wanted a place where we were free to worship what we wanted and in the way that we wanted to worship. So we've got a very kind of American quality of worshiping God here that's tied up with freedom in a way that Europe is trying to just kick off all tradition because it's been so oppressive in their understanding and their experience. So they want to just throw it to the curb for different reasons.
I kind of want to get your thoughts on how important it is that religion even tries to enter into this now warped and changed art society, if they shouldn't just really decide to make their own because, well, they started in the first place. I'm sure that somebody, perhaps someone like yourself or any other artist might be able to just
start your own world. Yeah.
Another thing, and I don't mean to take up too much time, it's just when I think of art, I don't necessarily think of anything that's created. There's a theory of intelligent design, like that flower that's up there on the screen right now, that didn't just come out of somewhere. Some force, some being created to be that way, or even the flag that's behind you that was specifically tailored to be that. Like when I think of art, I think of something that invokes some kind of emotion, whether it's visual or heard, or just anything that speaks to some kind of sense inside. So I also wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. The first question was about can't religious artists make their own world and not worry about the art world and their standards and their values? And I think that's true. And I am, and I know people like myself, they're creating their art. And I don't know if I gave you a handout, some of their societies that religious artists have created, and they're doing conferences and they have their own journals, that sort of thing. So that's definitely happening, and that's starting to break into the art world, and there's starting to be more and more. We're sort of at the cusp, I think, right now, where the religious worlds are they're trying to break into the art world, try to have a conversation with, like a good example, just in the Catholic Church, for instance, the Pope. In 2009, he had a symposium sort of like this, and he invited artists from all over the world to come and share time with him to talk about the relationship between arts, contemporary art, and religion. And he invited people like Bono and musicians and then architects and he was really interested in wanting to kind of bring art into the 21st century, but he also wanted to make sure that art didn't forget its roots in religious traditions. And it was a wonderful meeting, and what he said there, and you can actually read that online. It's on the handout I gave you. So things like that are happening. And then the Guggenheim in New York in 2009, that same year, did a show called The Third Mind. And it's American artists engaging with religions of Asia. And so you get to see the familiar artists that we know in art history books, but see them in a new way, because this exhibit, was highlighting the way that the Bhagavad Gita and the I Ching and Buddhist texts, Hindu texts, how they informed people like Pollock and people like Motherwell, different contemporary artists of the modern era. And so it was a way that the art world was recognizing, hey, we've been dealing with religion all along. We need to kind of be more conscious about that. So it's happening. It's just little by little. And then your second question was, yeah, any art that affects you internally or moves you in your soul, I think absolutely. And that could be anything from great cooking to great floral arrangements to the way you clean your sink. I mean, any of these things can be done with great care and with great love, with great grace. And that's all beautiful. It's all art.